Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. We are really honored on behalf of the Campaign Against Racism to share some reflections with you. Learning and evolving racial capitalism as a barrier to health equity. And the four of us are going to describe some of our experiences being able to be a part of this campaign over the past several years and really learn together about how to really fight structural racism in all of our contexts. My name's Michelle Morse, and I am one of the members of the Campaign Against Racism Coordinating Committee.
My name is Arti Bhatt. I'm part of the coordinating committee for the Campaign Against Racism and a coach for the New Orleans chapter and part of the Minnesota chapter.
My name is Sinashe Goronga. I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm also part of the coordination committee of the Global Campaign Against Racism.
Hi everyone, I'm Anne-Marie from Scotland, living in Spain and part of the Barcelona chapter and part of the coordination team as well.
So our three main goals today are to talk a little bit about the history of the Social Medicine Consortium and our global campaign against racism, to reflect a little bit on our journey towards really understanding and centering racial capitalism, and then talk a little bit about some of the paths forward for the campaign.
Thank you, Michelle. So I've got the honor to talk about our amazing story of some of the collective actions that has brought us to where we are today. So the whole campaign was preceded by formation of the Social Medicine Consortium, which is a collective of individuals and organizations, networks from around the world who are interested in social justice and health equity. So there were organizations, the SOCMED and EcoHealth, who were working together already in the teaching of social medicine, who came together in the fall of 2015, resulting in the formation of the Social Medicine Consortium. And as the Social Medicine Consortium, we have had conferences. Our first conference, which was reimagining social medicine in April 2016, was one of our first gathering of people from different parts of the world who are interested in health equity and demanding justice, who came together to have this conversation. And when we had our conference now in 2017, which was Beyond Reimagining Accelerating Praxis, there were now calls by people to be involved in actions and not simply talking about social medicine education, but actually being involved in advocacy and different work. And at that conference, one of the keynote speakers that we had was Dr. Kamara John, who presented on racism and the different levels of racism that manifest, be personal, internalized, and institutional. And during that session, everyone realized it was quite a revelation for a lot of people in terms of how racism manifested in our different contexts. And people collectively decided to embark on a journey of a global campaign against racism to see how we can dismantle the impact of racism on health in different parts of the world. So considering the different contexts that we were all coming from, what we did, we had various focus groups that involved people from different regions, East Africa, from the USA, to get their perspective in terms of how we can go forward. And that's one of the things that has been the core and strength of our story and our journey, the collective nature of it and participation of everyone. And through the dialogue and conversation, that's how we came up with the chapter model, acknowledging the different contexts that racism manifests, particularly sexual racism manifests in different parts of the world and how subtle it is. And we had a planning retreat where we involved community organizers to help us and equip us with the necessary tools and the different community organizing models that we could explore as we embark on the world. Then we officially launched the campaign in Gallup, Mexico, in 2018. Sorry. So this was launched in so the Social Music Consortium launched this campaign as the global component of the campaign against racism, which Dr. Camara Jones was the past president of the American Public Health Association was involved in. And so this was an opportunity for all of us to collectively together, to come together and state that a lot of the structural determinants of the health determinants of health, when you do the root cause, they all link back to white supremacy, to racism, and structural oppression that is as a result of racism. So in terms of our definition for racism that we decided to work with, we decided to work with racism with the definition of a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of one looks what we call race. So that's the most important thing, that is acknowledging that race is not a biological issue, but it's actually a social construction that has been used to unfairly disadvantage some individuals and communities, and also to unfairly advantage other individuals and communities. And it intercepts the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources.
One of the really important things that we also did as a part of the process for launching this campaign through the Social Medicine Consortium was really taking a step back and saying, across our campaign, across our organization, which is truly global and spans many, many countries, in the spring of 2017, when Dr. Jones invited us to be a part of this campaign and take on the global component, we spent the following year really exploring whether or not this was something that fit within the Social Medicine Consortium. And we did that through hosting focus groups with multiple different groups and communities within the Social Medicine Consortium, and asking kind of what are examples of racism that you think need to be addressed in your local context, and how might that work be advanced and supported through a global campaign. In addition, we didn't want to necessarily export a structural racism model that wasn't relevant or didn't work in the various contexts around the world that were thinking about becoming a part of this global campaign against racism. And so when we officially launched the campaign against racism in April of 2018 in Church Rock, New Mexico, on Navajo Nation, one of the activities that we did is there's a picture of it right here. We asked everyone to take a look at the definition of white supremacy, but we took white supremacy off of the definition and said, in your context, in your community, in your language, in your experience, what would you name this phenomenon? And again, the definition was of white supremacy. And this is the very intense and emotional and serious list of different terms that came from that activity. And you can see here, it's everything from imperialism to colonialism to racism to white supremacy to casteism, to Columbusing, and then multiple words in other languages, including Diné and Spanish and Haitian Creole. So that really helped us to really think more deeply about how racism is operating in all of these different contexts, how it might be called something different, but how all of those systems of oppression or systems of racial hierarchy are still operating, whether they're called racism or structural racism or not. So using the framework that Dr. Jones put forward over the past several decades, we really attempted in the campaign to get practical and say, clearly there's a role for the global kind of campaign and the coordinating committee to advance and support political education, consciousness building, and some of the support functions that are necessary for the campaign. But the most important work needs to happen at the level of the local context of each of the chapters that are part of the campaign. And what we encouraged those chapters to do as they developed their specific strategic goal was think about what it means to name racism, ask how it's operating, and organize and strategize to act in your specific local context, because we know that racism is operating differently in all of these different places.
So as you can already kind of tell, organizing and community organizing principles are really foundational to the work that we're doing as a collective campaign and locally. So I just wanted to share our overarching organizing statement from the Campaign Against Racism. We are organizing the Social Medicine Consortium to achieve racial justice across medical centers, universities, and organizations by educating health professionals about the structural and social determinants of health and supporting local campaigns which seek to address racism and the legacy of colonialism in the health sector globally. We will do this by establishing chapters of the Social Medicine Consortium with community organizing capacity, creating a scorecard for structural racism, and activating our networks by 2019. So this was sort of our one of our foundational organizing statements. After that, we actually had, back in 2018, convened a 3-day teach-in at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. The Highlander Institute is a place that has a very long history in the civil rights movement, that's sort of rooted in the United States, but also globally as well. And during that time, we really deepened our relationship with one another. We focused on the sort of tactics that we were using, and individual chapters and collectively, we were able to do some work on strategic goals across different campaigns. And so we came from that meeting together with a goal of the Campaign Against Racism, which is to dismantle structural racism and its effects on health around the world, because racism kills, by supporting local actions, efforts, and networks which aim to improve the health and lives of those most affected by racism. So really, really rooting in the local context and supporting one another in that work.
Yeah, and as a movement, I think we just wanted to highlight that these were principles that we kind of collectively came up with in Chiapas last year. And that was after a year of the campaign and of all the chapters organizing around structural racism. We started to think what were also our foundational beliefs as a movement. And these were the principles that we collectively came up with. Number one, I think is very much rooted in the Friday methodology of that we're all leaders, personally and collectively responsible of self-reflection. The next one is obviously the one which is foundational to us and comes from what was previously presented on structural racism, which is we must act in solidarity and in communities to expose and dismantle capitalism and racism as mutually reinforcing acts of violence while imagining a new reality that humanizes and centralizes the margins. And I think that's also a part of the campaign that we're trying to consistently center, is the imagining part, the visionary organizing also. The third one is obviously racial justice is required for health equity, therefore we must name and dismantle racism. And it's important there that we put seen and unseen, and then understand this intersection with other systems of oppression. And that's very much where we are right now as a campaign in our political education, is thinking through racism as a system of oppression, but thinking through the other intersections, particularly capitalism, and how they all uphold structural racism and also work together to strengthen it. And then the last one is very much a healing justice kind of area for us, and it's repair and create, reparar y crear. This is just very quickly where we are. So we have 23 chapters and we're across 9 countries. We have like half of those chapters in the US, and then we have the other half across the other 9 global contexts. And that ranges, you can see on the map, from kind of Zimbabwe to Barcelona, which we'll discuss more later. How are we building our capacity? It's important here that we put that for us, there's 2 areas, our vision's kind of 2 areas of building capacity always. One is political education, that we're all kind of still learning about, first of all, how this oppression is practiced in our communities, and then we're all learning about dismantling, and we're all learning about when we dismantle these systems, what is the path forward then for our communities. And then the other area that we very much focus on is obviously organising and community organising. And I think it's important to say that we're really trying to prioritise also this year in the campaign that we don't take one methodology from the US or one methodology from Spain, that we expose ourselves to organising methodologies around the world. And we've done that with Theatre of the Oppressed, with Decolonialised Feminism in Spain. Now we're doing Abolition 101. And then the other points I'll just make is more just, we have community calls, monthly community calls, and those are very much driven by the needs of the chapters. Sometimes that will be based on political education needs, particularly at the moment that's coming up around health workers engaging in abolition. But then that might also just be some space to reflect. There were some calls recently about how organising has changed in the era of COVID-19.
So just to sort of get you a little bit up to speed with where we've been, between July of 2018 and October of 2019, our members launched 26 chapters of the campaign across 10 different countries, like we showed on the map, including Haiti, Uganda, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Palestine, Lebanon, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, including some chapters in the United States. We have 250 active members of chapters. We've engaged 1,500 health professionals and allies, and we're constantly trying to enroll new chapters and broaden this network.
One of the examples of some work that's happening in one of our many chapters is from Nashville, Tennessee, which is in the southern part of the United States. And Nashville and Tennessee in general are communities and spaces where the history of the Confederacy is the U.S. Confederacy is very alive and well. So it was incredibly meaningful to see this chapter after 2 years of organizing successfully achieve its strategic goal. And you can imagine 2 years goes by pretty quickly, but it's pretty intensive work to get an institution like Vanderbilt, again, an institution very much rooted in Confederate history, to make such a significant change. And what they were able to do was actually get Vanderbilt to stop using a correction factor for Black race in the calculation of kidney function. So just to share a specific example of one of our chapter's successes in the specific work of their context of racism and health.
We wanted to also give the Atlanta chapter, because the Atlanta chapter for us is very much a chapter that we look to for in the third year, where we want to centre community partnerships, and we feel that they have from the beginning very much centred community partnerships, community organisers, and the marginalised and the most oppressed being the ones that drive forward their chapter goals. And therefore they've been able to do some very bold and radical kind of organising around the dismantling of the carceral state. More recently with COVID-19, they were involved in the right-hand side picture is of them in a car rally at the Free Them All campaign. But also during COVID-19, they very much put forward visionary organising demands around the moratorium on arrests for minor offences, immediate emergency housing, suspending all rent and mortgages. They also demanded, obviously, when thinking through the dismantling of the carceral state, the reduction of police presence in vulnerable communities. More recently, they've been involved also as health workers in the street medicine, and they've been responding as health workers to the mobilisations around the righteous resistance against the police murder of George Floyd and obviously others. And then more recently, they actually led our Abolition 101 with an incredibly powerful community organising group called Survived and Punished. And this is Barcelona chapter that I actually belong to, and we're very much focused on dismantling the white supremacy and the racial capitalism that's embedded in migrant policies, and leaves those unaccompanied minors, and especially young migrants, in such vulnerable conditions. More recently, we organised against age determination tests. We've been acting also as community mediators as young migrants have decided to start to occupy houses after becoming so tired of the criminalisation of themselves and communities and by the police. And then we've also been very focused on building community platforms, not only in Barcelona, but also in other communities outside Barcelona, and thinking through how collectively we can have racial capitalism community platforms, which obviously involves health workers that can respond to the current context.
Another example of kind of one of the cross-chapter initiatives that some of our chapters have been involved in is actually submitting reflections and public comment in response to a hearing that was held on the Ways and Means Committee. 4 of our chapters in the United States submitted public comments that are now a part of the official public record, really reflecting deeply on how racial capitalism is the root cause, or one of the root causes, in addition to structural racism, for the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color.
And then on a global scale, one of our collective actions that we have done this year was on the 1st of May. We had a Cancel the Debt party. So this came after the IMF and the World Bank talked about relief or suspension of servicing of debts, and we started a conversation about how we need to condemn and center the legacy of colonization and imperialism and racial capitalism, which has stolen the wealth from the different countries. So our chapter members from different parts of the world talked about how the history behind the IMF debt, some of the conditions that were there, like structural adjustments and their impact on health today, and also how they've been continuously promoting global inequality and affecting particularly countries in the global south. And this was and this really stimulated a lot of dialogue and raised a lot of awareness in terms of how we should continue questioning some of the systems that we have normalized today and how they continue to propagate inequality.
Yeah, so we just wanted to kind of discuss that we're coming actually towards the end of year 2. We're now moving on to year 3. We actually wanted to let everyone know also that applications are open for year 3 for new chapters, and we'll close the 5th of August. So if you are interested, please do contact us. But in the second year, we made a very deliberate choice to, as we said before, focus on racial capitalism and then center distributive leadership. I think before we often talked about in the campaign not wanting to in any way be complicit in the reproduction of systems of oppression, particularly within our communities. But I think in the second year, we really stepped up to demand that distributive leadership be practiced and ask chapters how are they practicing that. And some have practiced that more through the community platforms that we've referenced and bringing in community organisers to understand to expose themselves to different organising methodologies. Others have just made more deliberate kind of community agreements and community norms, and really tried to take collective responsibility for them. Another part that we centred in our Las Cruces retreat, so we have yearly retreats with the campaign against racism. This year our retreat took place 1 hour just from the Mexico and US border, and we really tried to centre what was the difference between raising awareness and kind of educational activities and organising, and we really kind of pushed our chapters to start to take collective responsibility for where were they falling in that spectrum. Were they falling more into this educational activity part, and how, if they were doing that, could they move more towards organising? And then we did a lot of organising, particularly in learning from the the new Jim Crow and Michelle Alexander kind of literature of what was organising in terms of shifting power, thinking about building power, thinking about dismantling systems, who we were working with, what our strategic goal was it specific enough to our context. And again, as we said before, we just always centre coming from racial capitalism and coming from organising from a global perspective. So with racial capitalism, it's ranged our political education from Cedric Roberts and the Black Reimagining to post-colonial theory. And then likewise, our organising methodologies are very, very much ranged from different contexts. And we very much endeavour to continue like that. Yeah, so I think now what we wanted to do was just take some time, each of us, and really go through, I guess, take space and really think about what have been the tensions and the struggles that we've had organising. And then also, I think more importantly, what have we learned in 2 years of organising collectively in a global campaign. So I can speak for the Barcelona chapter. We actually came in the second year of the campaign, so we're only 1 year with the campaign against racism. But it was interesting because we came in when this, the political education on racial capitalism was centred, and we were very much moving towards not only organising the structural racism, but thinking about the economic systems, and more importantly, the history of those economic systems that are in upholding racism. And it was interesting for Spain because we've always had, I think, a structural advantage of communities that have not really yet internalised neoliberal economic models the way other places across Europe have. And we very much in Spain connect that to, obviously, a history in the 1930s of having a socialist government, and then throughout, obviously, the dictatorship in Spain, we very much always had socialist class struggles and anarchist movements, and we see that those structures still very much alive today in Spain and in Barcelona. So an interesting struggle that we had was the anti-capitalism perspective was there, but the naming of racism and how it operates in our communities was not there. And we trace that very much back to, and still currently, to the European Union and the way that they have tried to consistently censor language, push conversations on racism to more go in a direction of diversity and discrimination and not talk about the structures. And that is obviously connected with the erasure of their own historical colonial past and the current racial capitalism that they are upholding, particularly for us in Spain at the border context. So in Barcelona, we're working with unaccompanied minors and young migrants that are mostly arriving from countries in Northern Africa. So we've really done collectively with community platforms a lot of political education around institutional racism and the white supremacy that is embedded in those policies and leading us to the outcomes in the lives that these unaccompanied minors and young migrants have. And I think finally we're at a stage after a year that we found that centering both systems of oppression has very much strengthened our organisation. When we organised recently around the situation of age determination tests, so there were age determination tests taking place illegally in Spain, and they were falsifying ages of unaccompanied minors and saying they were over 18. We were able to say that or organise around that and say that that came first, obviously, from the structural racism and the devaluation of the body on the social interpretation of their skin, but that falsifying age also came from economic interests and the desire of institutional racism and racial capitalism to invisibilize the situation of their money, and that they were saving money ultimately by doing that. More recently, we've been involved in the situation of of young migrants deciding to occupy houses due to tiredness of being criminalized on the streets with their situation, bearing in mind that criminalization leads often to direct deportations. And that's also been interesting because when we were organising more in public spaces, that seemed to be more acceptable. But now that we're suddenly kind of touching the capitalism system via property, we seem to get this like increased level of structural violence from the police and then from governmental policies. And that's what we've been dealing with right now. And I'll just end by saying that we are very excited, I would say, right now in Barcelona. We feel that the situation of the police murder of George Floyd and the global uprisings against anti-Blackness has really allowed space for Afro-descendant communities to lead the migrant movements. And we are excited by what that means for organising around racial capitalism in the future of the Barcelona chapter.
I think as a global movement, one of the key things that we have to be deliberate about is understanding the power dynamics that are operational in the present and in the past and up to now, and try to move away from recreating the power of those same dynamics. And the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the events that actually highlighted the same structural, the impact of the structural issues that we've been dismantling. So as a consortium, like as a network, as a campaign, we came together and we started to do work around organizing around COVID-19, the response to COVID-19, particularly the impact, considering its impact mostly affecting the Black communities in different parts of the world. And we also noticed that in the narrative of the various responses, it was often the global South voices which were not always heard. And even if you look at the distribution of resources, and also what we did is we deliberately created a space for global South voices through our webinars, where we got people from different parts of global South countries through our chapters to come and talk and amplify the issues that are happening in their context. And what in this conversation, we're also trying to challenge the global systems that sustain white supremacy. And most importantly, we were highlighting the importance of collective action to support local work, because in all of our work, our communities form the center, the central part, and our communities, the communities that our various chapters work in, are the most important thing. So we needed that as collective action in the campaign, we needed to support those local actions, and also needed to build global solidarity around those local actions, and also global solidarity in the global actions as we continue to try by all means to not only decolonize global health, but also to dismantle the systems that sustain the same frameworks in global health. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience of the Minnesota chapter historically and recently. That the Minnesota chapter of the Campaign Against Racism is made up of mostly health educators who have a vested interest in sort of dismantling the intersection of racism, capitalism, housing, and housing inequity and how it relates to health outcomes. So that's what we were organizing around prior to COVID-19 and prior to the police murder of George Floyd. And one of the things we had struggled with up to that point was, how do we continue to center the work that's happening in community? How do we continue to center the people who are most affected by the inequity? That is, people that are experiencing homelessness, which in Minnesota is predominantly Black and Indigenous people who are disproportionately affected by housing insecurity and the downstream effects, which are chronic health conditions and poor health outcomes. And then George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, Derek Chauvin, and it really pushed our chapter to interrogate the different levels of work that we needed to do and how to hold ourselves accountable. And so I wanted to share this value statement that we came up with, and then talk just very briefly about some of the things that we're doing. since then. So I'll just read it quickly. As members of the Twin Cities chapter of the Campaign Against Racism, we collectively acknowledge George Floyd's murder by the Minneapolis Police Department as another abhorrent outcome of over 400 years of racial capitalism and settler colonialism. As health workers and educators, we commit to personal and professional interrogation of our complicity in perpetuating systems of oppression that devalue Black and Indigenous life. We seek to build a culture with practices that hold us and our professions accountable to our complicity, expands our capacity to hold discomfort and deeply listen, and centers coalition building with community partners. We recognize that this involves cognitive, bodily, relational, and organizational work that collectively strengthens us to support the struggle for police abolition, and I should say decarceration in general, to participate in the care of Black and other marginalized communities in partnership with healers, and to support mutual aid networks in the Twin Cities. And this collective value statement was really sort of a labor of our chapter of looking at all the different levels of how systemic racism and racialized capitalism works, and the interconnectedness of it and the work that we need to do. And so I'll just say personally, sort of moving forward as a caste privileged South Asian doctor, part of that work for me has been doing a lot of the internal and relational work with other South Asian members of our chapter and physicians that I work with, to think about how I uphold white supremacy in my own context and how the work that I need to do to dismantle it. It's also involved us tapping into thinking about healing justice practices for our chapter. It's also, we're doing a lot more work on supporting mutual aid networks in the Twin Cities that are working on housing justice and that are really led by people who have the closest experience to the inequity of unstable housing and homelessness. And one of the things that we're really excited about moving forward is we have a partnership with a theater group called Zamia, and Zamia is a theater organization that's composed of people who have formerly experienced homelessness or who are currently homeless, who do theater of the oppressed work. And so we're working very closely with them to continue this type of like coalition building and really center the experience of Center the Margins.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne Marie and Tinashe and Arti. It's just, it's amazing. Again, like even for me listening, even though I work with these folks all the time, I'm still learning, even in this conversation right now. But I just wanted to share just some personal reflections on the journey of exploring how structural racism and racial capitalism are operating. And for me, I have to harken back to my time living and working in Haiti, which for me happened for the first time in 2009, but really accelerated after the earthquake. And I just have to, think about, for me, like understanding racial capitalism really came from understanding NAFTA and the Clinton years and understanding what that meant for Haitian rice farmers. Whereas NAFTA was celebrated as a huge victory here in the US for many people in power, it literally destroyed the Haitian economy and truly disrupted and changed the whole entire country in a way that created the conditions for the earthquake in January 2010 to be as destructive as it was. At the same time, years later, just in the past 3 or 4 years, you've seen movements in Haiti against debt collection and capitalist bodies like the International Monetary Fund. In fact, it was the policies of the IMF just a few years ago, moving to end fuel subsidies that led to one of the most recent rounds of uprisings in Haiti against capitalism and the explicit understanding in neoliberalism and capitalism that Haitians would be at the bottom, contributing their labor. and reaping nothing except oppression and early death. And that helped me to understand where I come from in Philadelphia, quite frankly, because growing up in Philly, it was very hard to understand as a kid and as a young adult why certain neighborhoods looked the way they did and others didn't. And it was in large part my experiences in Haiti, understanding the global dynamics of the American empire and neoliberalism and colonialism that helped me to see my own home of Philadelphia in a new way, and understand why a university like University of Penn could be in West Philadelphia for several decades and yet be responsible and held accountable to no improvement in health outcomes, virtually no improvement in health outcomes in West Philadelphia over the past several decades, despite its presence and despite it being one of the biggest employers in the entire city and a world-renowned academic health center. And it also helped me to understand why universities, and it's not just University of Penn, but many academic medical centers and academics like myself and our complicity in these systems are making the case, the business case for health equity. It was experiences in Haiti and then growing up in Philadelphia and then bringing that back to academia as well. And seeing, well, now I understand why there are some people making a business case for health equity and actually using a capitalist framework to explain why there's an imperative for health equity. That framing is rampant and it's everywhere. And I think it really is a symptom of the medical industrial complex that many of our chapters are trying to fight. So those connections for me were really about my personal experiences over the years and the experiences of learning from the communities that I was either embedded with or from, to make those connections and connect the dots and really just begin to deconstruct and understand how these systems interlock and lead to the health outcomes that we see all over the world. And the last thing I'll just say is that then makes it very easy for me to understand why the World Bank's narrative of 25 years of progress on eliminating poverty is so absurd, right? Because what is seen as progress is going from 1.5 billion people living on $1.90, $1 in US, $1.90 in US dollars a day to, I think 700 million. And that's considered progress. That's considered progress. That's the world that we live in. And that's why we're doing what we're trying to do in this campaign.
Yeah, so in most of the work that's been highlighted, be it in Uganda, in Haiti, in Zimbabwe, in Brazil, in Barcelona, in the USA, I think one of the most important things that we have to realize is the importance about community, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're trying to dismantle these power systems that promote inequity. So is one of the key things that we are looking into as we move into the next phase of the campaign is continue centering the voices of the community through expanding and strengthening our community partnerships. So one of the key things that we're really going to do is we're going to continue investing more in strengthening our community organizing skills, in building relationships with communities, in amplifying and centering community voices globally around the world. And also we'll continue analyzing the interconnections of racism and capitalism. I think one of the things that we have realized throughout our journey as the campaign is it's a continuous learning process. I think you'll always be amazed by the different forms at which these systems manifest, and the interconnections between these systems. And as we move, particularly as our campaign moves, even in other contexts in different countries, when we get more and more people sharing their perspective, it's mind-blowing how much in this world, like how much these systems, like the far richness of these two systems of oppression is globally. Then we also continue to build on our anti-racism practice, because that's one of the most important things. I think we should continue naming racism, and we should continue calling out racism in all the work, and it's still relevant. It will always be relevant until we reach a point of true true equity, because as long as the inequities that are existing persist, we still have to continue getting into that uncomfortable space for many of naming racism as a form of structural oppression. And we look forward to engaging more and hearing more voices, particularly the marginalized voices, particularly the indigenous communities who are often not represented on such platforms, and who are not represented in these discussions, to see how we can learn them, and also using our privilege as health professionals in different parts of the world to amplify those voices, to dismantle the structures instead of continuously propagating them.
So that's our presentation. And I just want to say how grateful I am for these people on the call and for the Campaign Against Racism, and just wanted to acknowledge the Campaign Coordination Committee, the campaign coaches. There's a coaching system for all the individual chapters. Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones, who has been sort of a grounding force for us in understanding systemic racism, and our chapters, amazing chapter reps, and all the community people and organizers that we work with. And then finally, if you're interested in the campaign, I know Anne-Marie did mention that we have open chapter applications, and we also are on social media, so feel free to follow us, email us, check out the website. And thank you so much for inviting us to share.